Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi, we've got a really interesting show today because how often do you actually have a show that is on dealing with a difficult child who has died? Because sometimes, you know, we act like they're angels and perfect and all that kind of thing, is that there's that perception that we have to think of our kids as perfect. And your sibling, right?
Absolutely, I agree with you, Mom. That's why I love the show. We are going to be being really brutally honest. You can love your sibling and love your child, and they can still be difficult. So we're going to be talking, like you said, with 3 experts today on what happens when a difficult child dies.
And we're going to have, do you want me to introduce the guests today? Or?
Sure, if you'd like to.
Okay, we're going to have 3 guests on. We're going to have our friend Marcia Alig on. Hi, Marcia.
Hi, Gloria. Nice to be here.
Great to have her on. She's been with the Compassionate Friends for so many years, and she was the president of the board.
She was. Marcia has served just about every role you can imagine at Compassionate Friends.
Yeah.
And like you said, she was on our board of directors. She has done so much and given hundreds and hundreds of hours to Compassionate Friends.
And she had a difficult child that died, and she's going to be sharing that information, which she does sometimes at Compassionate Friends meetings. And then we've got 2 great women here, and Barbara, I forgot to ask you before the show, but Bobbie.
Bobbie's good.
Comforto.
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 Yes.
Comforto. Okay. Bobbie Comforto. And then we've got Kane. And Bobbie's a social worker, and Ann is a psychologist, and they have this really great site called the Grief Channel, and you're on the island, right? But you're also in Manhattan.
Yes.
And you work with grief and loss, and I want to get into how you got into it and hear more about the Grief Channel. But let's start with you, Marcia. Talk to us a little bit about having a difficult child.
My son Daniel was our firstborn child, and he was dyslexic, as were all of my children, except that his emotional reaction to it was way, way over the top. He threw his first tantrum when he was 4 months old.
Wow. It's really young.
Yes, and he had colic, but I noticed that there was a difference in the screaming, and I went in and checked him, and the capillaries across his forehead had burst from screaming so hard from the tantrum. And the longer he lived, the worse they got.
Wow.
And the rest of us were walking around on eggshells to try not to spring off a tantrum.
Now, your husband's a doctor, right? Is that right?
He's a physicist.
Oh, he's a physicist. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and Daniel's brothers were both younger. When Daniel was 8 when he died. Paul was 5 and a half, and Graham was 3.
Wow.
And it didn't matter what they did either. He would get into these tantrums. They were so severe that he passed out.
Wow.
Now, did he die as a result of that?
He died as a result of being run over by a school bus.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And sometimes during the tantrums, after he passed out, he would wake up and start tantruming all over again.
Wow.
We never knew really what ticked it off,
Yeah.
which was why we were all being so really
And you have to
careful.
wonder if it's something, I'm sure you already checked this out, physical. Was something
Yes.
going on in his brain? Was something going on in his body?
We were in close contact with his pediatrician,
Yeah.
and his pediatrician even contacted a pediatric psychologist, or psychiatrist, excuse me, and he said, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with that child. The family just needs to communicate better."
But your other children weren't doing this.
No, they weren't.
Yeah,
Thank
right.
goodness. He was communicating fine.
Yeah.
He was telling us that life for him was really awful,
Wow.
and we couldn't figure out how to help him.
Right.
At one point, he had been at a neighbor's house and came home and ran upstairs and called goodbye. And I just knew something awful, and ran up, and he was hanging halfway out my bedroom window.
Oh my goodness.
His arms and shoulders and head were inside, and the rest was outside.
That's so scary.
And it was very scary, and it seemed to take forever to get across the room. Of course, I was
Yeah.
running,
Right.
but and pull him inside.
So he got hit by a bus.
Yes.
And that was an
killed.
accidental death?
Accidental
Yes,
death.
it was.
So I want to ask you, this child, and I know talking to other people, it took a lot of time,
Yes.
a lot of energy, a lot of the
Yes.
family dynamics. What happened after he died with the family dynamics? What happened with you, and how was it?
Well, in retrospect, we realized that dealing with him, we were becoming a dysfunctional family because we were adapting all of our behavior around him.
Right.
And so we had to unlearn that after he died. And some things took longer. For example, for Christmas, we had what I later called Hanukkah Christmases. We did not have all the glut on that day. We would start way ahead and give one present a day because that's all he could handle.
Oh, wow.
And like 8 years after he died, Paul, who was then the oldest, said, "Did you know other families have all their Christmas presents on the same day?" And, oh, of course, he's gone. We don't need to do this
Right.
anymore. And it was things like that that took us a while to adjust to change to being a more normal or more nearly normal family.
So did you have some guilt connected with?
Oh, there was tremendous guilt. There was
Well, and it
tremendous-
sounds like some of the medical establishment people were saying if you were just a different parent,
Well, yes.
he would be different, which wasn't true.
Which wasn't true.
Right.
Right. And when we happened to be away when the accident occurred, we were in California, and when we got back, both of us decided that we would not blame ourselves for being away. That
exactly.
it would have happened had we been there too.
Right.
And you were able to do that as a couple, which
As a
I think
couple,
is really
yes.
important because sometimes
Yes.
it can be one
Yes.
family member can blame another.
That is correct.
And
yeah.
of course, even though you say that, there's got to be a little bit of, if it would have been different, if I could have done something else. How
Of
about
course.
the other kids?
They,
were.
it was interesting because the older child, when he was little, he would look. He and Daniel were both left-handed, so they were the end of the table, and they would look across at each other at the end of the table. And Paul would try to figure out how he could get older than Daniel so that he could be the oldest one. Well, after Daniel died, that wish came true.
Right.
Not in a way he wanted it to happen at all.
So that magical thinking comes in.
Yes, and it was. You could see him struggle with that. It was difficult.
Wow.
Yes.
So I know you teach classes and work with people that have had difficult children. What do you think the main thing that you bring to them and that they need?
We do a workshop at the national conference, and besides using Daniel's story as a base to make it okay for them to
Yeah.
talk, because it had been my sense that they weren't talking about how the child lived. It was easier to talk about what had happened than how they had dealt with this child.
Right.
And Daniel being so young was an easy basis to set the bar down so that they could talk about how their children lived. And many of them got to tell stories that they would never have told in any other setting. Because when you go to a Compassionate Friends meeting, it is common for people to tell the best things about their
Yeah.
children.
Yeah.
And therefore, someone whose child was difficult feels, I'm the only one, and I better not say anything.
Well, I don't want people to think I didn't love my child
Right.
because I'm
yes.
saying that they're difficult.
Or they'll think I did something wrong to cause
Exactly.
that to happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Which brings me to the next thing I do is I teach him a mantra.
Oh, I like that.
And the mantra is, I did the best I could with the information I had at the time. And I make certain that they have said this many times before they leave the workshop.
And so you have them, actually that's their mantra, I did the best I could with what I had at the time.
With the information I had at the time. Right, right.
Yeah,
So that they would let themselves off the hook
Yeah.
Wow.
and not feel so guilty. We tend to feel guilty over everything, but this they do not need to blame themselves
Right.
for. And then the third thing I do is before they leave, I have them go way back in their memories and find a good memory so that they can leave the workshop with a positive memory of this child who, in many cases, dominated their lives until that child's death.
Yeah.
Wow.
I love that.
Yeah, I do too. Well, ladies, you do your grief channel on Long Island, and you have a great website, the Grief Channel, lots of articles, lots of stories, lots of things going on. And before you comment, I know you've worked with families who have difficult children, and before you comment on that, I wanted to ask you, how did you get into to the grief field? Do you want to start in?
Sure. Well, I was a single mom in graduate school, working full-time, and I was diagnosed with bilateral ovarian tumors. Wow. I thought I had cancer, but when they opened me up, they found out they were benign. And that got me thinking about what I really wanted to do with my life. So I started to study with Kubler-Ross and got trained to work with the dying. When you work with the dying, it's very natural to start working with the grieving. And that's how I got into grief work. But one day when I was in my own therapy, I started thinking about all the losses I had had in my life as a child. My sister died when I was 5, and my father died when I was a teenager. And then I thought a little bit more about it, and I came from one of those Irish Catholic families where people have a lot of secrets. And my father had been married to someone else for almost 15 years, and she died. And he married my mother 4 months later. We were never told this.
Oh, wow.
And my dad was very sad my whole childhood until he died. I was a grief therapist as a little girl.
Yeah.
I wanted to make my dad happy, and I tried so hard to please him, but I realized I've always been a grief therapist.
And your sibling loss, how do you identify with that,
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. That is an amazing story. How old were you when your sibling died?
5.
Oh, you were 5. And
Yes.
how old was your sibling?
She was a little baby.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, this certainly laid your foundation for being able to deal with difficult subjects and deal with people that are grieving.
And not run the other way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And how about you, Bobbie?
Well, it's interesting. Ann and I were teaching together at a Compassionate Friends conference that was done every year on Long Island, and we knew we had something in connection besides our work. I also had a very strong grief history. My mom was a Holocaust survivor.
Oh, wow.
Her mom had died when she was 8, and it was a very complicated thing, her coming to this country, but I had a sister who died when I was 2, and she was 16 in a car accident. So I also grew up in a family of grief, and I was the hope. I was going to bring, like yourself, bring somehow happiness and healing to the family. So, and then I had a previous career. I was a chef, and it was a crisis, and I had to decide what I wanted to be. And my first teacher was on the staff of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I also trained. And I ended up going to hospice after that, and I worked for 12 years in hospice. And then I ran a World Trade Center program, helped do that, and then private practice. So we had a similar beginning of loss in our childhood.
Yeah.
Now, when you're here, talk a little bit about dealing with a difficult child. What are your thoughts about it?
Oh boy, it's so much of a part of my practice. I always tell people that life is messy and relationships are very messy. And grief is not one emotion. Grief is many emotions. Sometimes grief is relief. If you had a kid who was drug addicted and has driven you nuts for the last 10 years, sober, not sober, in rehab, not in rehab, there is relief when it's over, no matter how sad you are at this person's passing. What I do in my practice, and I think you probably do this in yours, we have a forgiveness ritual where the parent who has lost the child brings in a picture and sometimes an article of clothing. I light a little candle, and the parent asks for forgiveness for whatever they need to ask for. And I play the role of the child, and I ask for forgiveness from them. And it's a very powerful and moving ritual, and it helps people kind of get past that, because there's so much irrational guilt when a child dies.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that the strong-held negative beliefs that the parent has about themselves, whether it's feeling guilty or shame or their frustration and their disappointment that they have had with their child, I think you really have to work with that, because to walk, it's bad enough to have lost a child, it's hard enough, but then to walk around with that feeling for the rest of your life, it's almost unacceptable. So whether it's done through spiritual methods like that, or through, we both do EMDR, and it's another really good method.
Yeah,
to
tell
help.
our audience what EMDR is.
EMDR is a method that helps you go back to early memories and early negative beliefs that are held, and it's by bilateral stimulation of the brain, where it helps the amygdala, where all those memories are held, and it helps to desensitize and reprocess.
Yeah.
So EMDR stands for eye movement. Originally, it was done with eye movement, and desensitization and reprocessing, because you really have to desensitize the pain and the struggle, as you said, that went on for years and years, and then reprocess that and turn it into being able to somehow find a place in your heart where you remember the good memories, and you also remember the love that you really have, because in between all the pain is this love too.
How about that early, I hate to say it, sense of relief? I'll have to say that one thing I thought after my son was killed was, I'm glad I didn't ever have his wisdom teeth pulled. As you know, all these little flashes of weird things come in. You know, oh, it's one less person I have to pay for college. I mean, just weird little things. It's like there's so much pain, and some little silly flash comes in. But with a difficult child, you also spend so much time. I mean, you have some time freed up. I mean,
time that I took away from the other two children, actually.
Yeah.
But your comment about that, my son Graham, when they told him that his brother died, and he was only 3, he thought, good, that's one less person to pick on me. Well, he was the youngest.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he thought, aren't I a bad boy to think that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the problem was there was no one to intercede at that time on that thought. And for many years thereafter, we could see him do really well, and then suddenly, splat, everything would come to pieces. And then he'd do well again, and then the same thing would happen. And it wasn't until he was 12 when he was working with a therapist who was able to tell him, the first thought was the right thought.
Right.
There were a lot of people picking on you.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It was the second thought that was the wrong thought. You're not a bad boy. You're a good boy.
Yeah.
What a difference that made for him.
Just to normalize it for him.
Right.
Yeah.
And for the family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes siblings, too, they don't get to go through that sibling process of fighting and making up. And a lot of siblings aren't friends till they're adults.
Right.
Right.
And they never get through the whole, I mean, I always think of the siblings, they're the kind of the playground of learning to get along with the world.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's normal to have ambivalent relationships. With your sibling, you fight with them, you play with them, they're confidant, they play a lot of roles. If I didn't like you at all, I wouldn't even fight with you. I wouldn't give you any energy.
Right.
So, but that's why I love the sibling program with Compassionate Friends. Because when a sibling would say something like that, the other siblings would say, that's normal, we feel the same way.
Right. Yes. Yes, that's important. Yes.
I also think it's so important for a parent to get to the point where they can make meaning of what happened. You know, life gave you this experience for a reason.
Yeah.
What is it? What can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? You know, how did this change me for the better or for the worse? And where do I want to go from
down
here?
the road, though.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
but eventually that's where you want to go.
And I love that Marcia does that now because I agree with you. Eventually we need to get to that place or we just end up tormenting ourselves forever.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's give some advice to people who are in that first year and who've had a difficult child. We know down the road, we've seen Marcia and all the good she's doing and all the things you guys are doing after your experience. But what about those people that are in, you know, this year or two? You want to start, Marcia?
Well, you don't need to blame yourself. It wasn't your fault. And a friend in Compassionate Friends called it grandiosity. The grandiosity of blaming yourself for everything, that it would have been entirely different if I had done something different.
Like you could rule the world.
Right, right. And
That's a good point.
We're not individual gods, and we can't do that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yes. So let yourself off the hook. Quit blaming yourself.
Say that to the camera.
Yes. Let yourself off the hook. Quit blaming yourself. You are not responsible for what happened.
All right. I like that. Okay. Why don't we start with you, Bobbie, because you're down in the end there.
Well, I think that, you know, for all grieving people, but particularly for people that have that complicated grief that we're talking about here, self-care is really important, and self-regulation, and finding the way to bear all the uncomfortable feelings. Mindfulness is a wonderful thing because it teaches you to befriend your own thoughts, even if they're difficult, and befriend your feelings, and be able to bear what you're going through. So I think self-care and all the different possibilities of meditation and physical self-care and talking with other people. Compassionate Friends is an amazing organization for bereaved parents, you know, because survival is a community event, so you need other people. So I often really try to plug people into groups and to meet with other people, so they're not so alone.
And you shouldn't look at other people's experience and judge yours by that.
That's true.
It is, when you see in your mind everyone else had a perfect child, it is a natural part of grief to idealize the one who died. And at one point my son, Paul, said, you know, if Daniel hadn't died, I don't think Graham and I would have been in athletics because Daniel was such a goody-goody. And I said, excuse me? The child we loved and endured? How can you do that? But it was just a natural part of the grief process for him to idealize the brother that died.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Absolutely. And remember those good times.
Yeah.
And what about you, Anne? What would you say?
Well, there are no saints, for one thing.
Yes.
And I always tell people the job of the first year is to survive. You just have to survive. I think grief journals help a lot. I think ignoring stupid communication helps a lot because people don't know what to say. And people are so freaked out by what happened to you that they often stay away. You know, it's almost like you're contagious. And you have to find, as Bobbie said, a really good support system and ignore stupid communications.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And find safe people. I like to call them safe people.
Yes.
Because people who can hear, and you know, people like you, and you'll find that people who have had a loss in their life will be maybe those safe people. Well, thank you guys for being on the show today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's been wonderful talking about this. And Heidi, we're going to have Bar Scott sing on our show now, and she is going to sing World on Fire. And she dedicates this to her son, Forrest. And Bar has written all this fabulous music, and we're very excited to have her on the show today.
Yeah, she has a beautiful voice.
Yeah, yeah. And thanks everybody for watching this show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you, and our guests I'm sure do too, that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and visit us at opentohope.com and tell your friends and family about the support that they'll find there if they've had a loss, and God bless. And now Bar Scott.
From somewhere so far away, the wind blew and found its way to me, and then it found you. It circled and run you around, lifted you off the ground. To you, we're sure to feel the wind. held on, you took my hand, you turned and spun me around till I was sure to feel